This video is based exclusively on official law enforcement statements, court documents, and verified reporting from major news outlets.
At first, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie looked like a classic abduction case. An 84-year-old woman, a quiet neighborhood in the middle of the night, a masked man captured on a doorbell camera, and drops of blood discovered at the front entrance of her home. But as investigators and forensic analysts continued studying the evidence, another possibility slowly started to emerge. Because when you step back and examine the details, a much more disturbing question appears. What if Nancy Guthrie wasn't chosen at random? What if someone already knew exactly who she was, how she lived, and how vulnerable she might be? In criminal investigations involving elderly victims, there is a pattern that appears again and again. Investigators call it elder abuse targeting, when someone identifies an older person living alone, recognizes their vulnerabilities, and sees them as an opportunity. And now, some analysts believe this is a theory investigators can't afford to ignore in Nancy Guthrie's case. Because if that theory is correct, the person responsible may not be a random stranger passing through the neighborhood. It could be someone who already knew Nancy long before that night ever happened. But before we examine that theory, and the details investigators are now looking at differently, take a quick moment to help the video reach more people. Leave a like if you want this case to stay visible and continue being discussed. And subscribe to the channel, because whenever new information emerges about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, you'll want to know immediately. Now let's start with the question investigators are quietly asking behind the scenes. Who knew enough about Nancy Guthrie to recognize just how vulnerable she was?
To understand why some investigators are now considering the elder abuse theory and the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, you first have to understand something about how crimes involving elderly victims often begin. They rarely start with violence. They start with observation. Criminals who target elderly individuals are not always looking for the strongest victim or the most secure home. In many cases, they are looking for the opposite. Someone who appears predictable, someone who lives alone, someone whose routine can be understood simply by watching long enough. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in the same Tucson neighborhood for decades, a quiet community where neighbors knew each other, and unusual activity rarely went unnoticed. By most accounts, she lived a peaceful and independent life. Friends described her as warm, kind, and welcoming, the kind of person who would talk with neighbors, greet delivery drivers, and open the door without immediately assuming danger. But independence in older age can sometimes create a hidden vulnerability. Investigators have confirmed that Nancy had some mobility limitations. She remained mentally sharp, but physically she moved more slowly than she once had. Like many people in their 80s, certain everyday activities required more caution. Even something as simple as answering the door late at night could become a risk. There were also signs that her nightly routine may have made her even more vulnerable. Nancy used hearing aids during the day, but like many hearing aid users, she likely removed them before going to sleep. That means if someone approached her home during the night, knocking, speaking, or even forcing their way inside, she might not have immediately understood what was happening. For someone intending to commit a crime, that detail alone could make a major difference. Investigators also learned that Nancy was no longer driving at night. Instead, she occasionally used rideshare services like Uber when visiting family. On the evening before she disappeared, that's exactly what happened. She spent the evening with family and later returned home. Nothing unusual was reported during that trip. The ride was confirmed. The evening appeared normal. But from an investigative perspective, even small details like that matter. Every person who interacts with a victim, even briefly, becomes part of the timeline investigators examine later. Rideshare drivers, delivery workers, maintenance crews, landscapers, service technicians. Anyone who had reason to visit the home or interact with the resident could potentially learn something about that person's life. And that's where the elder abuse theory begins to enter the conversation. In many criminal investigations involving elderly victims, detectives start asking a very specific question. Who knew the victim was vulnerable? That knowledge doesn't always come from close relationships. Sometimes it comes from casual encounters. A driver dropping someone off late at night might notice that the passenger lives alone. A contractor performing work on a house might see security cameras and learn where they are positioned. A delivery driver might observe how quickly the resident answers the door. Individually, those details seem insignificant. But to someone looking for opportunity, they can form a complete picture. Nancy Guthrie's home was located in an affluent area of Tucson. Public records estimate the property itself was worth more than $1 million. The neighborhood was quiet, well-maintained, and largely residential. But criminals do not always see neighborhoods the same way residents do. Where residents see safety, criminals sometimes see opportunity. A quiet street means fewer witnesses. Limited overnight traffic means fewer interruptions. And a predictable routine can make timing easier. Another detail investigators have considered carefully is Nancy's connection to her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, a nationally recognized television journalist and public figure. That connection meant Nancy was not just an elderly woman living alone. She was the mother of someone widely known. For most people, that fact would simply be an interesting family detail. But in criminal investigations, investigators cannot ignore the possibility that someone might have recognized that connection and seen it as leverage. Someone who knew who Nancy was. Someone who understood what kind of attention the case might generate. Someone who believed that targeting her could attract national attention. Of course, investigators have never publicly confirmed that this was the motive. But experienced detectives know that crimes involving elderly victims often involve planning that began long before the crime itself. And that planning often starts with something very simple. Watching. Someone may have noticed when Nancy's lights turned off at night. Someone may have seen when she left the house. Someone may have noticed how often visitors came and went. Over time, those observations can create something investigators call target familiarity, the moment when a criminal believes they understand enough about a victim to act. This possibility becomes even more significant when investigators examine the actions of the masked suspect captured on Nancy's doorbell camera. The man seen approaching the house did not wander around the porch. He did not search for the camera. Instead, he walked directly toward it. He appeared to know exactly where it was. That single detail has raised important questions among analysts reviewing the footage. Because criminals encountering a house for the first time usually hesitate. They look around. They check windows. They study the layout. But the individual seen in that footage moved with purpose. And when investigators see that kind of confidence, they begin asking another critical question. Had this person been here before? Or had they spent time studying the property from a distance? For investigators exploring the elder abuse theory, that question matters enormously. Because crimes involving vulnerable victims are often not random events. They are crimes of opportunity, but opportunity built on knowledge. Knowledge of routines. Knowledge of weaknesses. knowledge of when the victim is most alone. And that brings investigators to one of the most unsettling possibilities in the entire case. If someone targeted Nancy Guthrie because they believed she was vulnerable, then the real beginning of this crime may not have been the night she disappeared. It may have started weeks, or even months, before anyone realized something was wrong. If investigators are correct that Nancy Guthrie may have been targeted because of her vulnerability, the next question becomes even more critical. What exactly happened during the hours before she disappeared? Because when detectives reconstructed the timeline of that night, they discovered something unsettling. For nearly 4 hours after Nancy returned home, everything appeared completely normal. Earlier that evening, Nancy had visited family. The dinner had been routine, the kind of quiet evening shared by families every day. At approximately 9:45 p.m., she was driven back to her home in Tucson's Catalina Foothills neighborhood. Her garage door closed. Lights inside the home were believed to remain on. Nothing about that moment suggested anything unusual. But after that point, the case becomes a puzzle built almost entirely from technology. There are no witnesses who saw someone entering the home. No neighbors who reported hearing a disturbance. No emergency calls placed from the property. Instead, investigators had to rely on digital traces, small fragments of information recorded by devices surrounding the house. And the first abnormal event would occur hours later. Sometime shortly before 2:00 in the morning, Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera was physically removed from the exterior of the house. That detail alone raised serious concerns. Whoever approached the house did not accidentally bump into the device or damage it during a struggle. The camera appears to have been intentionally targeted. But removing the camera did not erase everything. Before the device was taken down, it captured images of a masked individual approaching the front door. The footage is brief, but investigators studying it immediately noticed several unusual details. The suspect appeared calm. Extremely calm. Behavioral analysts who reviewed the footage pointed out the lack of tension in the suspect's movements. Removing the camera required physical effort, yet the individual did not display the micro-expressions most people show during stress. No tightening of the jaw. No visible urgency. Instead, the man moved with a kind of quiet confidence, as if he believed he had time. That behavior has puzzled investigators from the beginning. Because crimes committed under pressure usually produce visible signs of anxiety, people rushing through a risky situation tend to move quickly, sometimes clumsily. But the person seen on Nancy's porch did not behave that way. Even stranger was the way he attempted to disable the camera. Instead of immediately removing it, the suspect first tried to obscure the lens using desert brush and foliage. The act itself seemed improvised, almost amateur. Yet moments later, he removed the camera entirely. That contradiction, awareness of the camera's presence but an awkward attempt to conceal it, has become one of the most discussed elements of the footage. It suggests someone who knew the camera existed, but may not have fully understood how to disable it effectively. And then there was another detail investigators could not ignore. The suspect was visibly carrying a firearm, but the holster holding the weapon appeared mismatched. Experts reviewing the footage believe the holster was designed for a long-barreled revolver, not the type of gun the suspect appeared to be carrying. That detail may sound minor, but to investigators it raised questions about preparation. Was the weapon meant to be used? Or was it meant to be seen? Because positioning a firearm prominently on the body can function as intimidation, a visual signal meant to control a victim quickly without needing to fire a shot. If the suspect confronted Nancy directly, that display alone could have been enough to force compliance. But the most important moment in the timeline may have happened just minutes later. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker monitoring system suddenly disconnected from her phone. The device itself did not fail. Instead, the signal simply stopped communicating with the phone that remained inside the house. For investigators, that moment may represent the exact point when Nancy Guthrie was no longer near her phone, and possibly no longer inside the home. When detectives lined up the sequence of events, 3 critical timestamps emerged. First, the doorbell camera was disabled. Second, movement around the property was detected by nearby sensors. And finally, the pacemaker monitoring signal disappeared. Those 3 moments all occurred within a narrow window of time. And when investigators studied that window, another troubling possibility emerged. The suspect may not have been on the property for very long. In many crimes involving planned abductions, speed becomes a critical factor. Criminals who already understand the environment often arrive knowing exactly what they intend to do. They approach. They complete the objective. And they leave before anyone realizes something is wrong. Nancy's neighborhood may have made that even easier. The Catalina foothills area becomes extremely quiet late at night. Traffic is minimal, and most homes are dark during the early morning hours. A vehicle entering or leaving the area at that time might not attract attention. Investigators later began reviewing security cameras from nearby streets, traffic systems, and surrounding neighborhoods. Thousands of vehicles would eventually be examined in an effort to identify one that might have passed through the area at the exact moment Nancy disappeared. But even after reviewing large volumes of footage, detectives still faced the same unanswered question. What happened inside the house during those final minutes? Blood discovered outside the front door added another layer of mystery. Forensic analysts studying the pattern described the droplets as round, intact spheres falling downward. That pattern is significant. It typically indicates the source of the blood was either standing still or moving slowly. It does not match the kind of smear pattern investigators often see when someone is dragged across the ground. Some experts reviewing the evidence have suggested that Nancy may have been alive when she left the house. Possibly injured. Possibly being forced outside. But still upright. If that interpretation is correct, the encounter between Nancy and the suspect may have happened very quickly. A confrontation. A threat. And then movement toward the door. For investigators, that possibility leads to another troubling realization. If Nancy Guthrie left her home alive that night, then the person responsible had complete control over the situation. And that level of control raises a question detectives are still trying to answer. Was this the work of a single individual acting alone? Or was someone else waiting nearby, ready to help the suspect disappear into the darkness? As investigators continued analyzing the timeline of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, another pattern began to emerge. One that raised even more questions about how carefully this crime may have been planned. Because the events outside the house that night did not occur in isolation. Something else was happening in the neighborhood at almost the exact same time. Around 2 a.m., a neighbor living behind Nancy's property experienced something unusual. Their dog suddenly woke up. Now that may not sound like a major detail at first. Dogs wake up during the night all the time, but according to the owners, this particular dog almost never did. And what the dog did next caught their attention. Instead of barking or wandering through the house, the animal walked toward the back of the property, raised its ears, and stared silently in the direction of Nancy Guthrie's home. The behavior lasted long enough for the owners to notice. At the time, it didn't seem significant. But later, when investigators began examining the digital records from the surrounding homes, another strange detail appeared. 2 ring cameras located on the rear side of that neighbor's property, the cameras positioned closest to Nancy's house, had suddenly gone offline. The timing was precise. Both cameras stopped transmitting at approximately the same moment the dog woke up. But here's what made the situation even stranger. The cameras on the front of the same house continued working normally. Only the cameras facing the desert corridor behind the homes, the direction where Nancy's property sat, were affected. When investigators learned about the disruption, they reportedly returned to that neighbor's house and asked a very specific question. Did you experience any kind of internet interruption that night? The cables connected to the cameras had not been cut. There was no physical damage to the equipment. The devices simply stopped transmitting for a period of time before reconnecting later. That detail opened the door to several possibilities investigators began considering. One possibility involves something known as a signal jammer. Signal jammers are devices designed to disrupt wireless communications within a limited range. Depending on the strength of the device, they can temporarily block Wi-Fi signals, security cameras, or other wireless transmissions. If someone approached the neighborhood carrying such a device, it could potentially interfere with nearby cameras while they moved through the area. Some investigators have theorized that if the suspect approached Nancy's property through the desert area behind the homes, he might have passed within range of those cameras first, disrupting them briefly before reaching the front of Nancy's house. But there is a problem with that theory. Signal jammers capable of affecting multiple homes are not always easy to obtain. Many of the stronger models fall into restricted categories and are rarely used in everyday criminal activity. That raises the question of whether the suspect seen at Nancy's door possessed that level of technical planning. Another possibility investigators considered is far simpler. The device visible in the suspect's pocket may not have been a jammer at all. It could have been a walkie-talkie. From a distance, especially on low-quality security footage, a handheld radio and a signal jammer can look nearly identical. And if that device was a radio, the implications become very different. Because radios are only useful if there is someone else listening on the other end. That possibility has led some analysts to ask whether the person captured on the doorbell camera was only part of a larger plan. Someone approaching the house, and someone else waiting nearby. Perhaps in a vehicle. Perhaps positioned somewhere along the road. If the suspect needed assistance leaving the scene quickly, especially if Nancy was injured or unable to move easily, having another person present would make the escape significantly easier. But there is also a third possibility investigators have considered. The device could have been a police scanner. Police scanners allow users to monitor local law enforcement radio traffic. Criminals sometimes use them to listen for reports of suspicious activity or emergency calls that might indicate police are on the way. In that scenario, the suspect may have wanted to know if neighbors had called authorities during the encounter. At this stage of the investigation, officials have not publicly confirmed which of these possibilities is correct. But the existence of that device, whatever it was, remains one of the most intriguing details in the entire case. Because when investigators compare that detail to the suspect's behavior at the front door, they see something that doesn't quite fit. On one hand, the suspect appears aware of the security camera and attempts to disable it. On the other hand, the method used to block the lens, a handful of desert foliage, looks improvised and ineffective. Those two actions suggest very different levels of preparation. One implies planning. The other suggests improvisation. And when investigators encounter that kind of contradiction, they often begin considering a possibility that complicates the entire investigation. the possibility that more than one person was involved. Perhaps one individual handled the planning, while another carried out the approach. Or perhaps the suspect simply believed he understood the situation better than he actually did. But regardless of which explanation proves correct, the events occurring around Nancy Guthrie's home that night appear increasingly difficult to attribute to coincidence. The dog waking up, the rear cameras going offline, the suspect approaching the house, and the pacemaker signal disappearing shortly afterward. All within a narrow window of time. When detectives study crimes involving vulnerable victims, they often return to one critical question. How much did the offender know before the crime even began? Because if someone targeted Nancy Guthrie intentionally, if someone recognized her vulnerability and studied her routine, then the most important part of this case may not be what happened during those minutes outside her home. It may be everything that happened before that night ever arrived. By the time investigators had reconstructed the timeline, analyzed the surveillance footage, and reviewed the digital evidence surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, one realization began to take shape. This case may not be about a random intruder. It may be about someone who understood far more about Nancy's life than anyone initially realized. Because when detectives investigate crimes involving vulnerable victims, they rarely focus only on the moment the crime occurred. They go backwards. Weeks. Months. Sometimes even years. They begin examining every interaction the victim had with the outside world. Who entered the home? Who performed work on the property? Who delivered packages? Who provided services? Who may have had the opportunity to learn something about the victim's routine? In Nancy Guthrie's case, that list is longer than many people might expect. Like many older adults who live independently, Nancy interacted with various service providers over time. Landscapers maintaining the yard, delivery drivers dropping off packages, technicians performing repairs, utility workers checking equipment, people who may have visited the home for maintenance or inspections. Each of those interactions might have lasted only minutes. But sometimes minutes are all it takes. A delivery driver might notice that an elderly resident answers the door slowly. A technician might see exactly where security cameras are mounted. A contractor might notice that the homeowner lives alone. A rideshare driver might observe that the passenger is elderly and returning to an empty house late at night. None of those observations are crimes. But in the wrong hands, they can become information. And in criminal investigations, information can quickly become opportunity. Investigators know that elderly victims are often targeted by individuals who initially encounter them through legitimate interactions. Someone who appeared helpful. Someone who appeared trustworthy. Someone who had a reason to be near the house without raising suspicion. Over time, those small moments can build something investigators call target familiarity. A mental map of the victim's life. When the lights turn off at night. When visitors usually leave. Which doors are used most frequently? Where cameras are positioned. When the neighborhood becomes quiet. That type of familiarity is extremely valuable to someone planning a crime. Because once a criminal believes they understand the routine of a target, the crime itself can happen very quickly. They arrive knowing exactly when the victim is most vulnerable. They know how long they may have before anyone notices. And they know how to leave without drawing attention. But there is another factor investigators cannot ignore in Nancy Guthrie's case. Her connection to her daughter, Savannah Guthrie. Savannah is a nationally recognized television journalist with a massive public presence. For most families, That kind of public recognition would simply be a point of pride. But in the context of a criminal investigation, it introduces another possibility detectives must examine. What if the suspect knew exactly who Nancy Guthrie was? What if they understood that targeting her would guarantee attention? What if the person responsible believed that taking the mother of a well-known public figure would force the entire country to pay attention? The letters reportedly sent to media outlets after Nancy's disappearance have only intensified that theory. In traditional kidnapping cases, ransom communications are usually directed privately to the victim's family. The goal is to control the situation quietly while negotiating. But in this case, the messages were reportedly sent to the press. That decision is highly unusual. It suggests the person responsible may have wanted the case to become public, wanted attention, wanted the story to spread far beyond Tucson. For behavioral analysts studying the case, that detail raises a disturbing possibility. The crime may not have been motivated solely by money. It may also have involved something else entirely. Recognition, control, or the desire to create a moment that would be seen by millions of people. That possibility may also explain some of the strange behavior seen on the porch camera. The exaggerated placement of the firearm. The suspect making sure the weapon was clearly visible. The strange attempt to cover the camera lens with desert foliage. Actions that did little to actually conceal the suspect, but guaranteed that the moment would be captured on video. Some analysts have suggested those gestures almost appear theatrical, as if the suspect expected the footage to be seen later, expected the images to circulate, expected investigators and the public to study every movement. Of course, investigators have never publicly confirmed that interpretation. But behavioral analysis in criminal investigations often focuses on one central question. Not just what the offender did, but why they did it that way. Because the smallest behavioral detail can sometimes reveal the mindset of the person responsible. As the investigation continues, detectives are still examining thousands of pieces of evidence. Traffic cameras from surrounding roads, license plate reader systems, doorbell cameras throughout the neighborhood, cell phone activity and location data, financial records, DNA evidence collected from the scene. Each of these investigative paths requires patience. Sometimes weeks, sometimes months. But experienced investigators know that cases like this are often solved by a single detail that initially seemed insignificant. A vehicle captured by a distant camera. A witness remembering something unusual weeks later. A tip coming in from someone who finally decides to speak. Or a piece of DNA that eventually leads investigators to a name. For now, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains one of the most unsettling mysteries investigators in Tucson have faced. But one question continues to linger over the entire case. Was this crime simply an opportunistic attack? Or was it the result of someone studying Nancy Guthrie's life long before that night ever arrived? Because if the elder abuse theory is correct, then the person responsible may not have chosen Nancy randomly at all. They may have chosen her because they believed she was vulnerable, because they believed she was alone, and because they believed no one would realize what was happening until it was already too late. Somewhere within the thousands of details investigators are still examining. The truth about that decision, and the person who made it, may finally reveal who came to Nancy Guthrie's door that night.
More than a month after Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home, the central mystery remains the same. Where is she? Investigators have examined the surveillance footage, analyzed digital records, reviewed thousands of tips, and reconstructed the timeline of the night she vanished. Every movement captured by cameras, every signal recorded by devices, every fragment of evidence has been studied again and again. And yet, the question that may ultimately solve this case is not only what happened that night. It may be what happened before it. Because if the elder abuse theory investigators are examining turns out to be correct, then the crime may have started long before the masked suspect appeared at Nancy Guthrie's door. It may have started with observation. Someone noticing an elderly woman living alone. Someone recognizing that she moved more slowly than others. Someone realizing she might not hear everything happening around her late at night. Someone learning her routines, her habits, her vulnerabilities. Crimes involving vulnerable victims often begin quietly, long before the moment when everything changes. A stranger watching from a distance. A person who once entered the home for a legitimate reason. Someone who had just enough information to believe they could take advantage of the situation. And that is the possibility investigators cannot ignore. Because if Nancy Guthrie was targeted intentionally, then the person responsible may not be a random intruder passing through the neighborhood. It may be someone who already understood her life, someone who knew the layout of the property, someone who knew exactly when the house would be quiet, someone who believed they had the perfect opportunity. For now, investigators continue to follow every lead. They are reviewing surveillance networks across Tucson, analyzing DNA evidence, examining thousands of vehicles that pass through the area, and interviewing people who may have crossed paths with Nancy in the weeks before she disappeared. Cases like this are often solved by the smallest detail, something that seemed insignificant at the time, but later becomes the missing piece of the puzzle. A vehicle someone remembers seeing. A person who behaved strangely. A moment that did not make sense until investigators asked the right question. And that's why public attention still matters. Because someone, somewhere, may still hold a piece of information that could finally explain what happened that night. Before we end, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Nancy Guthrie was targeted because she was vulnerable? Or do you think this was something else entirely? Leave your theory in the comments. Investigators often say that discussions like these sometimes surface ideas or observations people may not have considered before. If you found this video informative, make sure to like the video so it reaches more people who are following the case. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future updates as new developments emerge. Because until investigators uncover the truth, one question will continue to hang over this case. What really happened the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared?